the role of the audit committee really is to oversee financial reporting, and that's from the company's standpoint. It's my job or the audit committee's job to make sure that they have enough people to do reporting, that they can close the books and they can figure out how much revenue they have, and make sure that when somebody, a third party, looks at those financial statements, that they're correct. And it's also to look at their system of internal controls. And what I mean by that is whoever requests a check can't sign the check. There needs to be some checks and balances, authorization matrices for who can sign what. And it varies from, if you're a non-public company, you want to have those basic controls where where somebody's checking everybody else that's sending any money out the door, till you get to a big public company and you probably have 300 controls that the auditors look at every single year. So internal controls varies with the size of the company. And to be honest, so does financial reporting. I've been on private boards where they're just getting their first, learning how to close their books and getting their first audit, as opposed to a public company that it's a cadence. It's every quarter. Every quarter you close the books and you report to the SEC. You're on just a path of every 90 days, you're closing and reporting. And the audit committee looks at all the public filings. And for anyone looking to join a board or looking to learn more about a company, you should review, if they're public, review the public filings. There is a quarterly filing, 10Q, an annual filing, a 10K, but within that, there's lots of information about financial statements, more than you'll probably ever want to know. But up at the beginning, there's a business section that'll talk to you about the company and how they generate revenue. And I would suggest everyone should know how companies generate their revenue. That's the key for them to be a business. There's disclosures that you have to file within 4 days. If your CEO quit, you have to file they call it an 8K. They have all these numbers for things that the lawyers in here know and the accountants, but there's a lot of, and even in a proxy, it tells you all about the directors and the management, what they get paid, what their experience is, why they're on that board. So really looking at all these disclosures, and that area is getting bigger and bigger because the SEC, who governs all of this, is getting more active. And to be honest, Europe is even more active than the US. And then lastly, we audit committee has oversight for the external auditors. And that means we hire, we fire, and we approve what they're going to get paid every year. And we have a good relationship with the auditors, or that definitely is the way to make that happen more smoothly. So aside from just pure numbers on the audit committee is very often in charge of risk oversight for the company. And again, that's one of the main jobs of the board as you back up and look at it very simply. And so it's not only financial risk, but there's cybersecurity, there's regulatory, there's legal, compliance, ethics. There's these whistleblower lines, which everyone's probably heard of at your company, where if you see something and you want to anonymously report it, well, as audit committee chair, I get a copy of every one of those that get reported. And then I work with general counsel or whoever to make sure that every single thing is addressed properly. And as we all know, in the world today, it's changed from 5 years ago. There's risks don't go away. We just keep adding more. I mean, pandemic was one probably nobody had like a plan for, or maybe some of the larger companies did, the smaller ones didn't. Now we've got all of the geopolitical, we've got an economic downturn, higher interest rates. To be honest, everybody always has an investment policy, but not very many people looked at, what bank you were using until Silicon Valley Bank quit being a bank, so to speak. So there's a lot of risk out there, and it's in charge of the audit committee to usually get the whole list of it and make sure somebody owns the risk and what they're doing about it. If you want to go to the next slide, I would say best practices for an audit committee. It's typically 3 independent directors, and independent means the company's not paying you to do anything but be on that audit committee. And financially literate. Now, that can very easily be if you were a partner at a big 4 or a public accounting, if you were a CFO, but also a CEO that ran a P&L, or somebody, even Chitra ran a P&L at her company. So it's really people that understand the numbers and can look through those. You want to have a really good rapport with management, finance, the auditor. I think communication is the key. And to be honest, that's probably true for all the committees, because you're talking with management. You want to understand what they're doing. You want to advise them. You want to ask really thoughtful questions, and you want to meet the staff. I always meet the staff of the CFO every quarter and talk to them individually, the tax director, the audit, internal audit, the FP&A, and treasury, and just to understand what they're doing. I learn a little more about the company, but then they appreciate that somebody takes the time to meet with them. And so I always do that. And then the auditors, I have one-on-ones. I talk to them separately. I talk to them with the company. I'd say executive sessions are really important. Audit committee will talk to the CFO just alone. Is there anything you want to tell us and that? And what I view the audit committee is there to support the CFO and their staff, to make sure they have the right budget, the right people. And that's really important. And as far as transparency, we want to be upfront. We need to be transparent with management, with the board and the audit committee, with the auditors. And to be honest, we need to be transparent with our stockholders too. That's one of the SEC's, as you continue to add more reporting on our filings, it's all about transparency, letting the stockholders know what the company is doing, what's coming, and being able to look at that. We want to define new risks, responsibilities of the audit committee. You redo that every year. You relook at it during the year if something happens. Banking popped up in May for everybody, just to make sure who their banks were and was their money safe. And by the way, was it in more than one account? I think what everybody learned from that is don't put all your money in one place, and some companies to diversify. Audit committee needs to be focused. There's a lot of work, and you want to make sure the meetings address everything, but you also want to have time for everyone to ask questions and make sure that everybody in the room gets to talk. Some people talk louder and more forceful than others. You want to make sure as an audit committee chair that everyone voices their questions. You need to stay current. There's all sorts of rules coming out. Europe seems to beat the US all the time with privacy. Now with climate, I'm sure AI, they'll come out with something before we will. And then there's the auditors are audited. This Public Company Oversight Board, this PCAOB, we call it, the auditors get audited now. So there's a lot of government regulation in there, and companies really need to stay up on top of that. And set the tone. We want to make sure that the tone at the top of the company is, no tolerance. We're ethical. We want to do the right thing. And there's make sure that there's policies that if you cross that line, you're no longer working there. And then again, I talked about make sure the finance team has the resources it needs, and then annually evaluate the audit committee. Are all the members pulling their weight, doing their job, or what else can we do? And get management to evaluate the audit committee. How effective do they think we are? Management always has interesting, having been in management and on a board, I know in management, we also thought about the board and who works hard and who helps us and who is accessible. So that was really important. The last one really is what's going on, hot topics in audit committee. It's probably something only a finance person would ever say. But cybersecurity reporting, Chitra's going to talk a little bit about it. Executives get paid a lot of money, as we know, but now if something happens at the company after the fact, they're going to have to pay some of it back. We're going to have climate disclosures. Again, I mentioned Europe is coming out with new rules, and this newer ones are coming out on climate. Taxes around the world, every single country would like a piece of the pie, so to speak. They would like to have some of the money that you're making. And then again, I talked about auditors auditing auditors in other countries and that. So there's a lot to keep up with, and you need to make sure that you have the time to do it. So I'd say the only other thing on the committees, it takes time, and you really want to do a good job. The other committee that most companies always have, and standard if you're public, is compensation committee. And I'd say what they do is they really bridge the interests of the internal stakeholders with the external. So the management team and bridging it with the stockholders. And it's as this relates to compensation, talent, culture, strategy also. And it used to be straight, this is how our CEO is paid, or the C-suite. is paid, and compensation committees, most of them are renamed now: Compensation and Human Capital, Compensation and Talent Committee. And a lot of the DEI from the ESG has moved into the compensation committee, as you would expect. They always hire an external compensation consultant, and this is in public companies more, not in private. And that's to make sure that we're not doing anything unusual. It's within this peer group that I talk about. You get 10 companies that are similar to you, maybe in size, in revenue, in your competition, and you kind of, what is the average group? Are the CEOs paid in a 50 percentile as you look at a Radford or something? Are they paid at 60%? So they get a consultant to really help. And if you're trying to give a bonus or do something kind of for a one-time thing, you definitely want to talk to these external compensation consultants. So they set and approve the bonus plan, the pay, the stock plans for the company. Compensation committee is all in charge of any kind of stock plan. And that's because probably about 15 years ago, all the companies restated because they didn't account for their stock correctly. So backdating and all sorts of interesting things that no longer happens anymore. So they're, making sure that their stock, how it's awarded, that it's fair. And they determine, again, like I said, the CEO pay and this, what they call 16B officers. These are probably the top 5 highest paid or most influential people of the company. And to be honest, I used to have to convince people when I was the CFO that you didn't want to be a 16B officer if you could help it, because all of your information is public. Your age, how much you make every single year. And that's where you go in the proxies. So the nice thing is you can go look at any company on their SEC filings and you can see all of that information. And again, kind of like I mentioned, they have an expanded remit basically to pick up human capital, DEI, talent, and they work very much with the chief HR officer in the company. So that whereas audit committee is probably the CFO, HR and legal are always in the compensation committee from the company side. Next slide. So what are they doing? Again, we talked about executive comp, and there's a lot of work being done on that, because it's basically, what are you paying them in their salary? What are short-term incentives and what are long-term incentives? And what the shareholders want is they want pay for performance. If the company does really well, then they don't mind if the executives are paid well. And so is it paid because they hit a revenue target? Is it an earnings per share target? Is it how their stock performs in a group of companies that their peer group in that? So there's a lot to be determined on that. Your peer groups can change in a year if your revenue grew wildly quick, or if it dropped. You might find yourself in a different peer group. So it's important that the comp committee keep that up. And pay ratios is interesting. So this is a number that maybe for about the last 5 years we've had to put in, and it basically takes the median employee compared to the CEO. The average ratio, I think I looked it up for last year, was 163 to 1. And you can see things like this when you see the strike going on at the auto workers, and they're saying the executives got a 40% increase, and some of these auto workers didn't get one over the last several years. So it's getting a lot of attention. And I think compensation committees need to pay attention to it, need to explain or what's their philosophy and how that's working for them. Does that make sense for them? Diversity, equity, inclusion, there's more statistics. It's talked about, I'd say, at the board level, as far as the composition of the board, the composition of the C-suite, and then throughout the company. Because if we're not bringing people up from the ranks, they're not going, you're not going to hit the C-suite as much and the board. So there is a lot of work going on that, and hiring diversity officers within the company. I'm seeing almost everywhere to look at that. So there might be a dashboard or things that the comp committee is looking at and then asking about it, because talent has come up a lot too. It's been harder to hire people. Good talent can move around. You want to keep it. So how are we compensating them? And that kind of ties in with the future of work. Do they want to come into the office? Do they want hybrid? Do they never want to come into the office? So now the compensation committee looks a lot about what is the company's policy? Are they forcing them back in like the bankers? Are they suggesting that we'd love to see you 2 to 3 days a week? or are they fully remote? And I do think in some ways this brings you gotta have a different kind of manager. How are you going to do that and get the same culture that you had when you could see people walking in and out the door, or walking to lunch, or just, having just frequent conversations, just walking around the office. So I think that's going to be a challenge over the next several years. And comp committees looking at that with HR, understanding HR's recommendations, and how are employees engaged. They look at employee surveys. And what are they going up? Are they going down? What are some of the issues that the company needs to work on? And balancing the employees as part of the stakeholders is also really important. When you look at climate change, or doing the right thing, that the company, you've got to keep your employees engaged, but also your stockholders. In some ways, your stockholders, just make sure you make more money every single quarter, make more money. Well, now there's quite a balance that a CEO and the board has to do between your customers that want you to have sustainable products, your shareholders that want you to make more money, your community that you work in, and your employees. How do you balance the engagement of all of that? I think it takes a really extraordinary CEO these days too, to be able to work through that. And the other thing the compensation committee worries about is there's regulators that rate you. They're called ISS, Institutional Service. And Glass Lewis. Don't ask me how they came up with that name, but they just come out and they rate you on different things. And when you're looking for shareholder votes at your annual meeting, you want to add stock to your plan, you want to buy a company, or you want to have new plans approved, it's nice to get their approval. So you always want to understand what the regulators are looking for. So you'd think compensation committee wouldn't have a lot, but it also has a lot added to it over the last several years. The next slide. So the summary, in some way, you want to align all these elements of success. What's the pay mix? What are they really getting? Because you want to keep management, excited to work there and think that if they really do a good job, they will get paid for that. You want to make sure they trust the committee, the communication is good. Again, strategy, is it the right strategy and objectives as you work with the board? And are we paying, are those in that CEO pay? There's been some talk of adding ESG into CEO pay. I've not seen that trend as much, some DEI metrics. So there's a lot you can put in the CEO pay matrix, and you don't want to make it too complicated, or it's just not going to excite the CEO or the C-suite to work. You want to balance the shareholders, the influencers, and the regulators and the laws. So there's a lot to align here, and you have to talk about it. You've got to be very transparent, and all of this stuff gets filed, especially on a public company. You want to watch out for things like excessive pay. And this is where sort of the union that's fighting the auto workers right now, or the car companies and the auto workers, that's, just little tidbits or little snippets of the news will come in and what you'll see. So you want to think about that. Severance pay, what is that? Is it excessive? Clawbacks, where you get paid something, but they're going to take it back. And then discretion. During COVID, people said, well, the company didn't make their numbers because of COVID. And so there was, in a lot of cases, there was a one-time, well, we'll go ahead and give them a little bit of a bonus. You don't want to do that very often, if at all, because then it's going to get second guessed. And, the outcomes that you would love to see is the company has great performance because everyone was incented to work towards the same goals. You want to keep your talent, and you also want to make sure that because your people and your culture, they really are a competitive advantage. A lot of people work where they do because they just like who they work with. And I think that's really important. And they think the company values them.